There's a fascinating article in the latest edition of the New Statesman, and it delves into what appears to be an increasingly entrenched battle of the sexes. But unlike endless coverage of the manosphere and the trouble with men, this is maybe the first investigation I've seen looking into what's going on with young women. One thing it captures well is the real divide in outlooks between young men and young women, with its author Emily Lawford writing this. Exclusive polling by Merlin Strategy for the New Statesman reveals that young women, aged between 18 and 30, are by far the most progressive demographic in the UK. This polling found that young women are 26 percentage points less likely to feel positively about capitalism than young men, and much less likely to feel the economy works in their favour. They are also much more pessimistic about their own future and everyone else's. They also feel much more negatively towards young men than young men feel toward them. Later in the article, there's one bit more on the polling. Strikingly, the polling done for the New Statesman suggests more privileged women are the most pessimistic of all. Women in middle-class professions are less likely to say they feel valued by society, and are less likely to believe that if they work hard, they will succeed in life when compared with their working-class counterparts. Young men are now more likely to be unemployed than young women, yet young women are far more financially cynical. They are 21 points less likely than young men to believe that they will ever out-earn their parents. White women are more likely to feel the country is racist than non-white women. At one point, Lawford visits the Feminist Society at the University of Leeds, where she asks the group's members for their views on the young men they knew, and here's what they said. "I don't care for them," said a girl called Ruby imperiously. She had red hair and lots of silver jewellery. "They're not bad people, but they refuse to call out their friends who make other girls uncomfortable. They'll laugh at jokes that are sexist, racist, or homophobic. They don't care about political issues. I don't think they like women a lot. If a man is attracted to you," she said, "he might talk about things like toxic misogyny. If he doesn't fancy you, he won't bother. I feel like a lot of it is quite sexually motivated with men." I asked if they'd considered dating a man with different politics. They all immediately said no. "I don't think I'd even be friends with one," said one girl. "They don't see you as human." Only one woman, Evelyn, admitted to having male friends, though she was worried this made her a quote-unquote pick-me, trying too hard for male attention. Evelyn was concerned about what the men she knew were watching online. "The stuff that's being said about women is crazy," she said. "They're getting all these reels talking about bad stuff about women. And I get reels of women saying bad stuff about men. I try to think not all men are like this, but..." The polling in the article was conducted by a company called Merlin Strategies. Its founder, Scarlett Maguire, went into some of her findings when it came to how men and women saw each other on the New Statesman's podcast.
We're very used to hearing about young men's negative views of young women, but this really struck me because we found that, 72% of young men have a favourable view of young women, 7%, so not very many really, have an unfavourable view of young women. When it comes to women under 30, though, only 50% have a favourable view. The unfavourable view of men goes up to 21%, and then under 25 women, it's just 35% of young women who have a favourable view of men. And if you go into very favourable, it's just 11% of under 25 women. So we are looking at an environment where young women feel a lot more negatively towards young men than the other way around.
That gap in perception has had a knock-on effect on what men and women want from the future. The article goes on to say this. Ruby had recently carried out a survey for a course. She asked 30 final year students, 15 men and 15 women, where they see themselves when they're 30. Of the men, all but 2 said they wanted to be married with children. Only 3 women said the same. Even the women in relationships didn't want to get married. None in the Leeds group found this surprising. Most of their friends felt that way. "It's a much bigger deal for us to become mothers. We have to get rid of our career," Evelyn explained. "I'm not fully against kids. I just don't really want to lose the other things and become just a mother. I want to still be me. I will probably lose that." These women weren't outliers. According to the New Statesman's polling, young women are twice as likely not to want children as young men. All the Leeds women told me that they feared a reform government pressuring them to have babies. One woman mentioned Suella Braverman's pledge to scrap the Equality Act and repeal other human rights laws. It just feels out of control. Dalia, lots of information to go through there. I'm sure you have plenty of opinions about this one specifically. And it's certainly true, I think, that there is a misogyny problem amongst young men at the moment. But there is a lot of an us versus them narrative going on here. I want to know what your thoughts are about everything that we've heard there.
Yeah, so, there were some things that really surprised me. One of them was that they found that white women were more likely to think that the UK was racist than non-white women. That basically bucks the trend of any other comparable study on this topic. And I'd be interested to know, is that an outlier? Is that kind of a quirk of this study, or does that signal something like deeper? Is there a deeper, real shift happening there? The other thing that I wasn't as surprised about, but I thought was really interesting, was the fact that women under 30, and I think it's very important to remember that this conversation is happening with women under 30, because I think it changed some of the findings would change if you went towards or talked about women who are older, and for many reasons, and I can come onto that later. But it was somewhat surprising to me that women under 30 seem to be doing relatively better in the economy in terms of they're less likely to be unemployed, but they have less favorable views of the economic system. That kind of is somewhat not intuitive. You would think if you're doing better in an economy, you would be more favorable of the economic system. But what we're seeing here is that women are, yes, doing relatively better compared to men in their age group, but that doesn't mean that they think of capitalism favorably and all of this, which is, quite an interesting thing. I was a lot less surprised by the idea that heterosexuality is in crisis, and more and more young women in particular are not wanting to get married, are deprioritizing relationships with men in their lives. I think what we are seeing is that women are on strike until conditions improve. And there's so many different reasons, I think, for why not only the situation as women perceive it has declined so much, but also that women are responding differently to what they might see as some of the shortfalls of men and getting into relationships with men. The political is one. What's identified in this study, what's kind of emphasized a lot in this study is, look, men and women seem to occupy different worlds. Young men and women are occupying very different political and ideological frameworks. And that gap, that chasm is becoming so wide that it's kind of difficult to date across it. That's true. I work with a lot of young people, and it does kind of feel like they are living in different ideological frameworks from one another. But I also think there's a really key economic element here, which is this dual process of increased economic independence of women and increased economic impotence of men. So what do I mean by that? In terms of economic independence, obviously, compared to generations before us, women are more likely than their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers to be able to provide for themselves economically without the support of a partner. I mean, it was not that long ago, it was still in living memory, that a woman would not be able to get a bank account, to get a loan without sign-off from her husband. So when you remove that economic dependence, you get into this situation where a lot of women are like, look, I don't need a man for money. I can provide that for myself. I don't need a man just for company. I have my friends for that. And also, I think we're seeing a cultural shift. Single women have historically been very stigmatized. I think due to a lot of very hard work from women, that has changed. This idea that being a single woman is tantamount to like social death has changed. And that's a very, very good thing. And so women are like, look, the one thing I actually need from you is emotional availability, emotional intimacy, and emotional connection. And that is the one thing that men have just not been socialized on how to provide. It's the one thing that men are not taught how to do. I don't think when you look at the way that young boys are raised, that they are taught to really prioritize connection and prioritize the work of connection, whether it's with their partners, with their friends, or even with themselves. And so a lot of women are like, well, if you're not going to provide for me the thing that I actually want from you, then I'm just going to build a life that doesn't require having a male partner in it. And then I think the kind of what I call the sort of economic impotence of men is, the gendered ideal of men that they have been taught to aspire to, which is, male breadwinner, the ability to provide, financially for you and for a family. That is no longer economically viable anymore. The economy is completely broken. And so when you have a group of people for whom, they are constantly being told this is what you should be, this is what you must be socially and culturally, but the material world that they live in makes that impossible, that breeds resentment, it breeds anger, and it breeds depression. And that's a very difficult combination to date. You don't want to date someone who's resentful and angry all the time because, what they have been told they need to aspire to is something that they repeatedly are unable to get to for many reasons, many of which are structural. And
from Larry Stevenson, where he's speaking with Daniel Priestley, talking about the idea that these all these influences, especially financial influences, but also the manosphere influences too, a lot of men engage with, they're saying like if you fail, it's because you didn't try hard enough,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
So essentially putting the onus upon them to be this archetypal breadwinner figure, which, as you say, economically incredibly difficult for them to aspire to. And Gareth's like, you're giving people mental illness by doing so. It's really, really toxic. And I think it plays into what you said before about these ideological frameworks. And there's an increasing shift, I think, in men going towards an individualistic framework, which is why it's all about, going towards the economics of individualism and chasing being the entrepreneur or whatever it is, or cryptocurrency, these kind of things that obviously I'm not saying this is universal, right? But these are more kind of popular amongst men than women. And whereas women are going towards far more collectivist beliefs. So we saw in the same data there from Merlin Strategies, women having a more favorable view of communism than capitalism, right? That's a real divergence, I think. One thing I have an issue with is that if we're in this position where one half of this gender divide has an increasingly negative view of the other, Ash writes in her book, Minority Rule, about how leftist movements of the last 15 years or so haven't focused enough on solidarity and that we've become a little bit tribalistic in focusing on individual demographics rather than trying to find things that unite those demographics together. So if we don't tackle this antipathy towards the genders that we're seeing at the moment, it's going to be difficult to find the common bonds that we can share to then try and bring people over on the things we disagree about. So, for example, right, all of these different things that men and women, young men and women, seem to not understand about each other are going to be difficult to mend if we can't find ways in which of uniting, in my opinion, around class issues. Because again, everybody can agree, economy super screwed up for young people. Men and women, super screwed up. They should have different prescriptions on how to solve that issue, whether it's through state policy or through collective action, which women seem to more prefer, or whether it's through rugged individualism, every man for himself. You must try as hard as possible to be able to break out the system on your own without collective action. That seems to be the men are more likely to go towards, especially kind of Zoomer men. And to try and find a synthesis of that brings everybody together so that we can then fight what is, again, the issues around gendered politics in this country. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think that the key message there is that this rugged capitalistic individualism is not going to liberate you. What is going to liberate you is actually, there's so much Fox News discourse about the wussification of men, but I think that there is part of I think a lot of men would really benefit in their younger years from learning how to be a little bit more like girls, in the sense of how to prioritize connection and how to see yourself as interdependent with and responsible for and accountable to and cared for and caring towards other people. Because I think that kind of what we've done is we have pushed men into this, and what these kind of a lot of these influences and this manosphere thing has done is it has taken this antipathy and brokenness and alienation that I think people across the genders of all genders are experiencing, and pushing it into a dog eat dog, competition, domination kind of attitude. The Jordan Peterson would probably have a similar diagnosis to me in terms of the economics of why we're in the situation that we're in. But his argument is, okay, well, the way that we deal with that is we just take away women's economic independence and we make them reliant financially on men again, so that they have to marry and they have to be in relationships with men in order to be able to survive. When obviously, if you actually looked at it from a different perspective and you said, look, what if men and women could come together and fight against an economy that requires people to have to exert these kind of power balances between one another, where, you know, one group holds all the power financially and the other is reliant on them? Because, by the way, like, a loving and good relationship can never exist in a context of economic reliance, as far as I'm concerned, or economic dependence. And so actually being able to offer a vision that is liberating for both men and women is absolutely critical. But I think it's very difficult, because I think a lot of the time that kind of ideal of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, getting ahead by dominating and exploiting others, remains the ideal of masculinity that we have in the West. And until men are able to decouple themselves and disinvest from that in themselves, it's going to be really difficult to be able to kind of bridge that divide, because I don't think that that's work that women can do for them, if that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, I can certainly understand that point. It's got to be something that men themselves get into. Like James Bloodworth does really good work, I think, in talking about men's mental health and stuff like that, and talking about the lack of men going to therapy. A good article he did today on that kind of stuff. But one thing I do want to go back to, in the article, obviously they went to a feminist society specifically, and I think they kind of got boilerplate feminist opinions that they would have got if they'd gone to any feminist society for the past 4 decades or whatever. So it did seem like Merlin's strategies weren't exactly pulling necessarily archetypal views of what women think, whereas there's a lot of, I think, as you say, some pushback to the kind of attitudes that a lot of younger men do have. But we were talking before the show, actually, that when it comes to, I think, a really kind of healthy gendered politics in this country, I think millennials have got it. I think millennials have got it. You know, I think that we've generally, broadly, amongst our demographic, been more likely to break down gendered expectations and the expectations, not just in terms of like the sharing of household responsibilities, in terms of approaches to the economy, approaches to gendered expectations on top of that, but also when it comes to like dating and things like that, though it's become far more equal in terms of who's expected to do what, in terms of how relationships are formed, who approaches who. And I think that's a really kind of healthy dynamic that millennials have. But Zoomers, significantly more conservative in the way that I've seen them approach these things. And gendered expectations, especially gender, I think there's a lot of gender expectations that have been put on men from all sides, whether it be from women they're trying to date or from men who are trying to influence them, that have broken down a lot of what was built by millennials. I don't know what you think about them.
I think that what you're seeing is a much more significant polarization and divide between how different genders approach these questions, that for Gen Z is making connection and understanding across these divides very, very difficult. I think with millennials, and I think it also varies between like older millennials and like younger millennials, but we didn't have as much of a like polarizing dynamic, but also I think we weren't as wrapped up in kind of like internet cultures, which I think a lot of these sort of like gender wars stuff kind of emerges from. But I do still fundamentally think that the fact that a lot of women are saying basically, it is not life or death for me to be in a relationship. Like, I will be in a relationship if that relationship offers something to me that I want and meets certain expectations. I think that is also something that millennial women have, and that is separate to and kind of exists outside of like polarized or like extremist online discourse. I think that's rooted in a very real thing. But I think that maybe there wasn't as much of a space for, I think, millennial men compared to Gen Z men. You know, I think a lot of my single millennial women friends would be like, millennial men also suck. But like, I think that compared to Gen Z men, I think millennial men felt a little bit like, okay, I've got to kind of get on board with some of this. So I'm going to try and sort of like figure out, there sort of was more of a negotiation and a settlement. Whereas now things have become so polarized. And I don't think that we can draw a comparison between women saying, you know, I don't think I want to get married, or I don't want to be in a relationship, or I have built a vision of my life that does not include a man. I don't think that's the same as the way that the manosphere talk about women. Because I think for women, it's the thing of like, look, the conditions of heterosexuality are fucked and I'm going to build my life so that I don't have to participate in that. Whereas the manosphere is based around dominating and breaking women down. I mean, we saw it in that kind of Louis Theroux Manosphere documentary. We've seen it when, you know, clips have come up in our news feed. So I think that they're kind of very different, and therefore, like, one is, I think, a response to quite legitimate conditions, even if sometimes it's articulated in these kind of boilerplate, you know, I don't want to be, like, I think the phrasing that I found a bit kind of corny was like, one woman admitted to having male friends but was worried that it would make her pick me. Like, I don't think that that's a general view amongst young women. I think that is something that, you know, was kind of very specifically picked out from like a university feminist society group. But I think that the idea that women are saying, look, I'm going to cultivate a life that does not require me to make huge concessions about how I want to be treated and what I value in my life, just because you're telling me that being single is no better than social death, I think that's a really good thing. And I say that as a woman who is like getting married in July to a man, nonetheless, God forbid. But for me, the fact that single women, like the conditions for single women and partnered women are really intimately connected. Because if we allow single women to be stigmatized, to be shamed, to be economically punished in the way that they have historically been, then the conditions for partnered women is also going to go downhill, because now I can be in a relationship where my partner doesn't have to meet even the bare minimum, because he can say, well, you have to put up with me or you're going to be out there single, which is like the worst thing in the world. And then in relation to that, if the conditions for partnered women, if women are accepting really shit behavior in their relationships with men, then women who are single who might be dating men are going to basically be met with this idea that, well, my married male friends or my partnered male friends give their partners the bare minimum, so I, in dating you, can give you the bare minimum. So our conditions are really related. And so for me, I think being nihilistic about it is very much against my politics, because being nihilistic about the ability of people to change and the ability of people to find solidarity, you know, that is so tantamount to my politics and is so oppositional to my politics. But I do think that the idea that women will be like, I am going to cultivate a full, connected, enriched life that doesn't involve having to participate in a relationship that will break me down, I think that is overall a really good thing. And I think that men stand to learn something from that, which is that in the wake of the heterosexuality crisis, building your ability to connect with yourself and the world around you, rather than retreating into this individualism, is actually more conducive to like your own happiness and liberation, as well as the happiness and liberation of people around you.
Okay, one thing I would like to finish off on here is that I think the level to which that there is antipathy here, of course, we talked a lot in this segment. It was obviously an article a lot about women's opinions here, but we've kind of talked about it within the context of like women's reaction towards the behavior of men. But in one of the quotes that we got there in the article, this person did specifically mention, obviously, the online discourse does have a lot of content with men being disparaging of women, but also said the same in reverse too, that women are getting a lot of content about like, you know, oh, men deserve to be lonely, the loneliness crisis is self-inflicted. And do you think that there is not a level to which this goes both ways?
I don't think so.
Okay, I mean...
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Because I think the idea that the loneliness crisis is self-inflicted... I mean, look, that compassion understanding has to underpin this entire conversation. Like it is, and to say like the male loneliness crisis is, deserved, is obviously like lacking in compassion, and it is lacking in kind of like political strategy, because, you know, that's not where... You don't get somewhere by just kind of by simply kind of laughing off a kind of crisis that that a group of people are experiencing. But I think it is kind of like, well, look, you know, because you know the term incel, involuntary celibate, I know we're going like so over time right now, so I'm going to try and like be really quick. But the term involuntary celibate was actually developed by a woman of color theorist who was talking about how the kind of sexual rejection of women who do not fit the aesthetic or beauty norm has created this thing called involuntary celibacy. And the response to that was for women to create communities with one another to fill that emotional and social gap. Whereas it's interesting that the political response to that for men has been kind of the opposite, which has been to kind of turn inward and to create these kinds of deeply hierarchical ways of thinking. And I think that saying like, look, when you say the male loneliness crisis is self-inflicted, it comes in a harsh package, but the other way of saying this is that like, it doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to say that the only reason that I can stop a woman from leaving me is by having a society that coerces her to be there with me. Like have more, like building self-esteem and building connection is the only antidote, and building solidarity is the only antidote to this kind of hate. But I don't think that they can be equivocated in that way.
Okay, yeah, I can understand that perspective for sure, no worries. Well, thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
It's been an absolute pleasure. We definitely go into the weeds with that last story.